Okay, great. Well, welcome today. I'm Andrea Zafiro, and I'm the academic director for the Sherman Center for Digital Scholarship. And I'd like to begin our event today with a land acknowledgement. And though we are convening remotely and through cross-geographic collaboration, we're organized institutionally through McMaster University. And McMaster sits on the territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a treaty between the Anishinaabe Mississaugas and Haudenosaunee that bound them to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And I'd like to center these sentiments in our space today. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome Carolyn Sinders. And Carolyn is giving the talk today, and she'll be leading a feminist data workshop next week as part of the SSHRC-funded Relevant Research Workshop Series, which is a partnership between the Sherman Center and Spark. Carolyn is a machine learning design researcher and artist. She's the founder of Convocation Design and Research, a design research agency focusing on the intersection of machine learning, user research, and designing for public good. As a designer and researcher, Carolyn's worked with groups like Amnesty International, Intel, IBM Watson, and the Wikimedia Foundation. Carolyn's also a research fellow with the Harvard Kennedy School. She's held fellowships with organizations such as BuzzFeed, IBEAM, Soho 20 Gallery, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, the Studio for Creative Inquiry, and the International Center of Photography. And Carolyn's work has been featured internationally, including at the Victoria and Albert Museum, MoMA PS1, the Houston Center for Contemporary Art, Slate, Quartz, and the Channels Biennale. And Carolyn holds a master's degree from New York University's Interactive Telecommunications program. And on a personal note, I'm thrilled to be able to host Carolyn at McMaster, even if remotely. I've used Carolyn's writings and projects in my classes, and Carolyn, I'm really grateful for how you've allowed me and my students to consider critical concerns about emerging data technologies through the lens of artistic practice and inquiry. As one student said to me last term, this work gives me hope about having a role in devising a future that I want. And so with that, I will hand it over to you, Carolyn.
Well, that's so nice. So nice to hear. Thank you so much. I really appreciated that. Thank you all for having me, and thank you for honoring me with your time. I really deeply appreciate that. I'm going to be giving a presentation just about some of my work and my work practice, and I'm hoping we can engage in conversation afterwards. So I guess on that note, I will get started. Oops, sorry, sometimes this happens where like the Zoom UI will go right over the presentation UI and then you can't press anything, which is so helpful. Anyway, thank you for coming to my presentation. So the way I describe my practice is I describe it as research-driven art. And it's really thinking about how aspects of research can shape an artistic practice and as well as questioning. Oops, sorry, there we go. I can't see the mouse, so I'm trying to do my best. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm Caroline. I'm an artist and researcher, and I work at the the intersections of civil society and the private sector. And I look at the impacts of technology in society and its effects on marginalized groups. I've held residencies with BuzzFeed and IBEAM, Pioneer Works, the Mozilla Foundation, Harvard, and I currently sit on a working group of the United Nations looking at data privacy in children, and I'm an artist with Ars Electronica's AI Lab. I think what's important to point out is my background is in photojournalism, and then I got a master's in design and technology. So this background of mine is in journalism, research, design, and art. And I see everything through the lens of legibility and research storytelling. And these are skills I honed as a photojournalist. So with these skills, I make art and I do human rights research, again, focusing through the lens of how design and technology affect people in their everyday lives. Research-driven art is how I define my practice. And While it seems obvious, it's art shaped and driven by research, be it quantitative or qualitative. However, I don't really make data visualization, but I could. And rather, the way I think about it is, what if you made net art or technology-based art with the same principles of photojournalism? So like photojournalism, research-driven art uses specific structures and a sense of purpose to constrain it. These constraints work much like the way a skeleton works. While they stabilize the practice just as the rib cage stabilizes the body, they do not define the entire practice nor keep it from moving and flexing on its own. So in this way, the research I do stabilizes and shapes my art, but it does not dictate the outcomes. In late May 2020, after the United States erupted in protest for Black Lives Matter, and after George Floyd's death, I noticed a number of curators and critics remarking on social networks about tech artists and their roles in unpacking technology, injustice in society, and activism. But most of these tech artists they were referring to were white and male. Over email with the curator and writer Nora Khan, we discussed artistic practices during moments of cultural upheaval. Khan wrote to me, quote, "How might critical technology work be called on in this moment to do more? Coded design work has that capacity. Hybrid research practices can explain and expose the logics of racial capitalism, but under the auspices of artistic collaboration, which can enact critique and make an argument through process and through a built system," end quote. And it's this idea of usefulness and interdisciplinary work, which is, I think, a key and necessary part of a research-driven arts practice, and is directly inspired by Tanya Bruguera's arte utile methodology, which loosely translates to utilitarian art. Arte utile draws on artistic thinking to imagine, create, and implement tactics that change how we act in society, again, heavily focused on usefulness, on tool building, and on community. In this email, Khan highlighted the strengths of work stretching across domains, in her words, making art a necessary Trojan horse to discuss useful change. Personally, this is where I turn to the work of American artists Francis Singh, Joanna Mull, Adam Harvey, Mimi Onoa, forensic architecture, and others. These artists are pulling from research or investigatory-based practices, and with work that manifests into a variety of outputs, artifacts, writings, and education. The practices of American artists, or the anonymous group behind ScanMap, a map that is mapping and sharing police scanners and information about where the police are moving, are great examples of social justice and human rights-driven art. Again, ScanMap's work tracking police scanners, or American artists' work, I'm Blue, If I'm Blank, I Would Die, and My Blue Window, two pieces that comment on the structure and violence of the modern police forces, one of them which you see here. This is an example of Adam Harvey's work. There are other examples of social justice, research, and artistic practices, which I turn to, like the works like The Hidden Life of an Amazon User by Joanna Mull, or Adam Harvey's V-frame research, which you see above, which came out of his numerous collaborations with the human rights archiving group, the Syrian Archive, or the investigative work of forensic architecture. One example of a research and social justice-based art practice is Mimi Onoa's. Onoa's research work on the politics and injustices of data sets have resulted in artworks like The Library of Missing Data Sets and the widely cited and canonical zine and educational tool, The People's Guide to AI, co-written with Diana J. Nuchera. These pieces and artists occupy a liminal space of research, journalism, and art. So why am I focusing on design in this, and why is design a part of my practice? Because everything around us is designed, from how we entered this Zoom meeting to why we can or cannot block people on platforms like Slack, and we can't, to how information is presented to us on Twitter and how the world physically surrounds us. This slide is a cheeky nod to Don Norman, the design of everyday objects. But effectively in the design world, we assume that design is universal, seamless, and intuitive when it is not. In some cases, like these doors, design make objects appear that they function one way when they don't. But even further, why does design matter when we talk about art or algorithms or AI or recommendation systems? Design can elevate and obfuscate, but design isn't just a skill, but a practice and a language in and of itself. So start solving problems around complex issues, but also creating spaces for human connection. Design needs to be at the equal forefront of this conversation. Design is what distills code and policy into digestible and interactive interfaces for users. Design is the thing that explains what code and policy are outlining. So for issues like labor, harassment, security, and privacy, design is extremely important. How does design translate into policy, for example? Online harassment reporting, like you see here, is a great example. Users don't have to deeply understand a social network's policy on harassment in order to report it. Design takes the technical infrastructure, the ability to select a piece of content, click on it, and then click on what kind of harassment it is, as well as the political infrastructure of a platform. What kind of harassment or harm is the content falling into? And then describe the policy in a way that is short and hopefully understandable to all users, and then folds all of those processes into product design, the harassment reporting system. Security settings are another example. For a user to report content, they shouldn't have to be a lawyer, and to adjust security settings, they shouldn't have to be an engineer. So design helps make complexities understandable to everyday people. And design affects things like policy. For example, we can look at areas like dark patterns. Dark patterns are design patterns that intentionally or unintentionally trick and manipulate users into making decisions they wouldn't normally make, and have been focused on in large general press publications recently, even though designers have known about dark patterns for years. Some policy researchers have pointed to this recent popularity or focus because dark patterns have started to cause more serious widespread damage. For instance, when filing taxes or in implementations of the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. As we see here, this is really quickly, this is a common dark pattern I've noticed in GDPR pop-ups. For example, if you click on cookie settings, that's where the actual consent buttons are all hidden. So this is a consent button hidden under multiple steps, and it's a dark pattern. So again, why design? Can a door be political? Yes, it can. And can it be art? Well, perhaps. Well, what does art do? It transports us, it's poetic, it analogizes, it creates artifacts of visual interpretation. It is not necessarily direct or didactic. It is different from design, or rather, it aims to achieve different things. How can design be art? Traditionally, and I'm looking at this from a United States design sense since I'm an American, design is often described as something that's useful, but also something that's profitable. In the US, where I'm from, design was taught to mean objects, utterly usefulness, and things purchased. But design is so much more than that. Design affects so much more than that. How can design be something explorative, speculative, poetic, and still critique and comment on the moment? Personally, this is where I turn to critical design. Critical design is design that addresses the limitations of product design. Critical design as a term was coined in 1997 by Anthony Doon, and it comes from a practice he developed with Fiona Raby when they were research fellows at the Royal College of Art. Critical design as a practice is one among a growing number of approaches that aims to prevent and define interrogative, discursive, and experimental approaches in the design practice and research. Critical design demands that design stop existing in terms of capitalist production, which is a function of product design, and push design towards self-examination and cultural critique. Doon and Raby highlight that by acknowledging that the design profession needs to mature and find ways of operating outside of the tight constraints of servicing industry. At its worst, product design simply reinforces capitalist values. Design needs to be seen for what it is, just one possibility, and to develop alternative roles for itself. It needs to establish an intellectual stance of its own, or the design profession is destined to lose all intellectual credibility and be viewed simply as an agent of capitalism. By redefining how product design can be created, critical design also creates new ways for an audience to engage with design and understand all different facets of design in their daily lives. These aforementioned works, such as Doon and Raby, Mimi Onawa's, Adam Harvey's Forensic Architecture, American Artists, can be viewed solely as research or just as art, but are much more richly seen when viewed as research-based artistic activist practices. So in this context, design and art are the same for me. While this is a wordy description, it still rings true to the intention of the works. These works aren't just to bear witness, though that alone would be worthwhile. They question, they provocate, and they offer a solution to a problem. They should not be viewed as a form of techno-solutionism, however. The solutions the artists provide are not meant to create an end-all, be-all to all other potential solutions, but rather offer temporary or open source fixes for gaps in inequity and violence created by society, and thus are poetic witnesses of those gaps. This kind of Band-Aid is in a similar space where I pursue my own practice. Band-Aids exist as necessary provocations or patches, while participatory design and deconstruction, along with artists and human rights researchers and activists and technologists and communities, can come together and overhaul systems or destroy systems together. This togetherness and collaboration is key, though, but nonetheless, provocations within art and design can create new imaginaries for new realities. And I'd like to quickly show you some projects and explain where they came from. One art project, Social Media Breakup Coordinator, has come out of my 8 years of studying online harassment and how systems create harassment. I look at the affordances of technology. Do UX and UI decisions mitigate harassment? Can they amplify it? I think that they can. Think about if you were being harassed. What does the system allow you to do? What can you do to create safety in that space? And how can you be safe? Some of my research focuses on the harassment of everyday users and then journalists who face extremely large threats like governmental censorship or surveillance, all the way down to more regular and systemic forms of harassment, such as what I call drive-by harassment, random harassment that appears, or harassment campaigns. This research I've been doing has been supported by different organizations like Harvard and the Open Technology Fund. Within this research, it also inspires art as well. Social Media Breakup Coordinator comes out of this space of research of spending a lot of time studying how content moves online, of what we can do to react to it or stop it. And in the case of harassment, how people relate to being online, of how we as a society respond to being online, and these really structured, designed, and constrained spaces. What are the new kinds of anxieties and tensions that come up? For a lot of victims, for example, regardless of technical background or job, and this is something I hear journalists say a lot, they feel like they shouldn't be upset by what is said to them online. But you can be. It's okay to be hurt and affected by someone calling you dumb, or sending you a slur, or sending you something as egregious as a rape threat. That's supposed to hurt. So as a researcher, I look at these anxieties, and as an artist, I create explorations and interventions around them. This is an example of Social Media Breakup Coordinator, which is a performance art piece that explores the very intertwined and interconnections of our offline and online lives. This piece has gone through 3 iterations since 2015. I'm exploring the connections between our digital tools and human intervention. Where do algorithms fail and humans must intervene? As users of social media, people live their most beautiful, angry, complex, and complicated lives online. So I've been exploring a series of solutions or suggestions following someone wanting to break up with a platform and how that would be coordinated or where the suggestions would come from. So something similar to perhaps a therapist or an assistant helping coordinate this breakup. And it's looking at this sort of messy decoupling that would occur from someone trying to extract themselves from an algorithmic space like Facebook. How do they remove aspect of themselves even when quitting? So in the performance piece itself, like an algorithm, I create a series of solutions that can be combined for a variety of situations, perhaps following a best friend breakup, someone wanting to unfriend coworkers on LinkedIn, or trying to figure out how to friend a coworker on Instagram, for example. And breakups can also include romantic breakups as well. So every participant sitting with me as the coordinator signs a legally binding document drafted by my collaborator, a lawyer named Fred Jennings. This outlines that I am not a therapist and I am not responsible, nor can I be held liable for damages, which I recognize is a very American thing for people to fill out. Then users fill out a 21-point user quiz where I prescribe answers out of an algorithm I hand wrote with less than 20 suggestions. These suggestions are then puzzle pieced together so the user feels like they are receiving highly personal advice, when in fact it is just algorithmically generated. Social media breakup coordinator is also a direct comment on the United States' lack of healthcare and mental health support, as well as the growing gig economy. Because in this project, I'm effectively a gig economy therapist, as well as a digital security trainer and advice giver. So for a few dollars in 15 minutes, people fill out a survey and I give them real feedback. It started off again as this algorithmic feedback, me mimicking a real life chatbot, but then it turned into real short feedback sessions. And the feedback and the questions and the interactions are all pulled from my very real research of seeing the general anxieties people have about being online. It's exploring this idea of expendable help and how anxiety about the internet isn't necessarily taken very seriously, but it should be. And through this, I've created a series of public data sets about these anxieties. In February 2019, I took over Baby Castles again, where we had first hosted Social Media Breakup Coordinator, to host an entire month of Social Media Breakup Coordinator with new artwork, a video game arcade, and weekly talks featuring Fei Lu, Pamela Lau, Jacqueline Maybe, Charles Bukowski, Molly Soda, as well as others. Video games installed were Wrongbox by Molly Soda and Aquin, Museum of the Saved Image by Flan, Yet Another Exhausted Day by Candleman Games, Attack of the Terms and Conditions by Mace486, Wonders of the Internet by Let Off Studios, and Valentine Doom by Dugug and Sub-Zero. The games themselves, combined with talks and performances, were all meditations on the problems and anxieties within social media. We created a moving algorithm projected on a wall inspired by our workshops at the end of the exhibit, all while still holding social media breakup coordinator sessions. I also curated a series of posters on disconnecting with technology and social media from artists and researchers like Sadet Harry, Merritt Kay, Helen She-Wolf Singh, Solmia Siga, and myself. And this is me in session at Baby Castles. And then later in December 2019, I won a residency with Academy/Solitude. Along with Alex Fifigea, I created a critical design chatbot. The bot is designed to respond to questions and care for a victim of online harassment, as well as a series of open source best practices and guides in what to do when facing a variety of online harassment. The bot is an extension of Social Media Breakup Coordinator because it's reflecting some of the conversations I've had while as a coordinator of giving people advice when facing harassment. The bot also tells the user it shouldn't exist, but it does, and it does to fulfill this void created by platforms. But the help and feedback the bot is providing should actually be handled by real people and trained professionals on these platforms, but that help doesn't exist. Until that kind of infrastructure help exists, the bot will. So my work likes to play with this idea of being useful while also highlighting deeper issues at play. This is another project called Higher Resolution, which ran for 2 weeks in September 2019, created with Hyphen Labs. We were the lead artists for the Tate Modern State Exchange. Higher Resolution used interactive work, talks from international technology experts, and hands-on workshops to examine the state of power and privacy online, from widespread surveillance to how AI is shaping human culture and relationships, to the threats of emerging technology that can pose to human rights. Artists and speakers hailed from Amnesty International, Change.org, the BBC, the Carnegie Trust, and other international organizations. The reason I was so excited to work with Hyphen Labs was having the ability to bring in policy researchers and political activists and watchdog groups directly into our artistic collaboration with the Tate. It's important when creating activist and social justice work as artists to avoid replicating unintentionally work done by activists out in the field. Instead, we need to work directly with those activists. When fighting data surveillance, the way to create change is to work together and create many levers of pressure in the public space, and arts institutions are a necessary part of that lever of pressure. We need to avoid creating work alone, only in the space of art, and we should seek collaboration with other artists and researchers who are working on identical or similar issues. The 2 weeks of programming unfolded in a unique space designed to mimic the different layers of privacy we toggle between online, as well as a floor schematic, which you can see part of here, highlighting different privacy concerns in our everyday lives. Some of the metaphors we were using to describe aspects of publicness and intimacy are the town hall, which is an analog of Twitter being the most public, the park bench, an analog of Facebook, which feels slightly more intimate than Twitter, since it's hard to take content off of Facebook, even though it's quite big, the living room, an analog of WhatsApp, feeling more intimate and private than per se Twitter or Facebook. And the loo, or the bedroom, which is an analog of intimate text conversations between 2 or 3 people. There were also art installations highlighting the perils of modern technology like facial recognition, website tracking, and harmful content recommendation algorithms. The following images display of a participant voting on a feature to ban and tear off truisms describing surveillance capitalism. The goal of this project was to bring conversations of privacy with policymakers into the white cube space, to transform these conversations and make them more actionable and tangible for museum goers. How often does the lead of an advocacy campaign get to face-to-face engage with people who sign their campaigns or engage with arts organizers? Another example of a research-driven social justice art project is my project, Feminist Dataset, which was started in 2017 as a response to the many documented cases and problems in technology and bias in machine learning. It is a critical research and art project that examines bias in machine learning through every step of the machine learning pipeline, from data collection, data training, neural networks, and new form of user interface, as well as the projected creation of a feminist artificial intelligence system. This project is inspired by the work of the maker movement, critical design, arte utile, the critical engineering manifesto, and the feminist principles of the internet. Feminist Dataset is a multi-year project using intersectional feminism as a framework for investigating technology, specifically machine learning. It's trans inclusive and focusing on racial justice. It's extremely process-driven, so the outputs of the project, or the artifacts, are workshops, and they're workshops on data and machine learning. The workshops are key since they are a mechanism to think through what community-driven, equitable data collection could look like. In the workshops, we discuss what is intersectional feminism, what does it mean? We talk about Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's work, the creator of the term intersectionality. We also unpack what is intersectionality in rating. For example, let's look at an article about income inequality. An intersectional feminist article would highlight that white women, Black women, Indigenous women, Latinx women, and trans people of all different races are paid all different amounts. So an article that simply represents all women as a monolith is not intersectional, cannot be in the data set. So then our workshops, community members then research and submit written data, be it poems, texts, blogs, transcripts of conversations, whatever. The only time my hand as a creator appears is to remove non-intersectional data, and I'm extremely firm about this. Feminist Dataset also operates in a similar vein to Thomas Thwaites' toaster project, which you see here, a critical design project in which Thwaites builds a commercial toaster from scratch, from melting iron ore and building circuits and creating a new plastic toaster body mold. Feminist Dataset, however, takes a critical and artistic view on software, particularly machine learning, whereas Thwaites is a comment on hardware. What would it mean to thoughtfully make with machine learning, to carefully consider every angle of making, iterating, and designing? Every step of this process needs to be thoroughly re-examined through a feminist lens, and like Thwaites' toaster, every step has to actually work. Here's an image from when Feminist Dataset was installed at the Victoria and Albert Museum. A current iteration of Feminist Dataset is a project called TRK, or Technically Responsible Knowledge, which is an open source project that examines wage inequality and creates an open source alternative to data labeling and training in AI. So this is a part of the Feminist Dataset project now focusing on cleaning data, labeling data, and preparing to train data to generate an algorithmic model. And so it's looking at the systemic issues around labor and visibility and the creation of maintaining data structures and training data algorithmic models. TRK was funded by the Mozilla Foundation and was created along with Cade Diem, Ian Arnaud-Fuma, and Rainbow Unicorn. Over 2019, I interviewed research labs, startups, and artists who use Mechanical Turk style services and microservice workers who use Crowdflower, Fiverr, and Mechanical Turk. I even became a Mechanical Turker myself. So TRK is this alternative, an open source alternative for data set training and labeling, which is a time-consuming but integral aspect of machine learning that must be completed in part by a human. The tool offers a wage calculator to help visualize a living wage to those who will be responsible for completing the tasks. As an artist who uses AI as a material to explore and make art, I was struck by how many startups and research labs and artists use Mechanical Turk style platforms, but without any thought really given to the payment structure determined for workers on those networks. Mechanical Turk and similar platforms have had well-documented cases of horrendous worker-related issues, such as severely underpaying contracts. In many instances, if a lab or individual is trying to price equitably, the interface of Mechanical Turk works against it. If the machine learning pipeline is death by 1,000 cuts, I think of TRK as one small band-aid for one small cut. The project isn't proposing a solution for all issues related to machine learning, or even a major one to Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Some of the issues of machine learning are issues of a more ingrained societal inequity, which can only be addressed through large shifts and restructuring in society or legislation. Both in this, as a designer and researcher, I try to look at what kinds of research can help alleviate or expose issues. TRK focuses on how, through pricing structures, platforms incentives, and the invisible nature of gig work, clients underprice, undervalue, and fundamentally misunderstand how tasks are handled in human-as-a-service platforms. Part of the design thinking behind TRK is to examine equity and transparency within interfaces and the design of tools. What kinds of problems tool design, UX, and UI create in technology. So inspired by datasheets for datasets white paper, TRK injects plain text information to a dataset with information that includes a description of what the dataset is, when it was made. UX or user experience design is a utilitarian intelligence focusing on architectural layouts, usability, user flows. But design has a politics to it. It can suppress or uplift content. Design, much like technology, isn't neutral. So as an artist, I use design as a material to confront and comment on the slickness and inequity of for-profit technologies. I'm an artist that deals with complexities and like the trauma and conflicts of others online. Sometimes the tools I use don't quite work. So what if I could make them better? An interface is useful and expressive. One thing I've noticed as an American living in Europe is how the US relates to design as an artistic medium versus Europe. And design is not necessarily viewed as an artistic practice in the US. So I encourage others to reflect back on critical design, the methodology of removing capitalism from the structure of design. Design can be a tool, much like technology and much like art, to create political small acts of resistance and change. What kinds of design can we make when we stop viewing it through a Western Silicon Valley neoliberal and capitalist lens? We've seen code and art made without the constraints of capitalism. It's time for design to do the same. Critical design, social justice, and design justice are needed now more than ever for tool making, for design to confront how it's perpetuated white supremacy and to change its relationships to power. Design can be an actuator for change, but design alone is not an entire solution towards injustice in society and technology. Design can confront a problem while acknowledging it's part of the problem. Design can help visualize or highlight parts of systemic injustice, but design must unpack and confront its role in contributing to injustice in technology, especially technology in Silicon Valley. I use design as an artistic practice and a lever to create the usefulness to explore problem solving. Similar how the anonymous programmers created ScanMap to provide a solution for surveilling the police, or Everest Pimkin has created a tool to blur images of people to take photos at protests. Design can sit in a space to solve small problems that are part of bigger spaces and bigger issues. My approach to design thinking proposes a decommodification of art and situates it as a process and an investigation. Artistic approaches to problems allow for collaborations that might not happen in other fields. And it's in this way, art's role in social justice and human rights projects makes space for new kinds of work that other fields traditionally could not let those projects exist. What does change look like? I think it has to be interdisciplinary across many fields of art, activism, policy, and social justice, working together and not separately. Thank you for your time. So I guess if there are any questions.
I guess I don't need to moderate. We can I can sort of stand in the background and let you continue. Let's see the chat. Perhaps we'll just let folks take a couple of moments to gather some thoughts and questions, and then feel free to put those questions in the chat or use that incredible hand function and just let us know that you'd like to ask your question. Great. We have Luis. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation, Caroline. I'm just wondering if you have any, if you could give us some, or your thoughts in terms of who can do feminist research or who can label their research as feminist. I'm saying, like, this is coming from some work that I'm doing as well, but I have and I was, so since I started the master's and then the PhD, I have engaged with bibliography, readings from that have a feminist perspective, and so I'm very interested, and I think I'm applying some of them. But but I don't, I don't call my research feminist because sometimes it is said that as a male, you can't label your art or your research in that way. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic question and definitely a really thorny one. I'm not really sure even how to advise. I think one of the places I'd maybe start with is maybe citing or saying, what are the different kinds of feminist practices or research methods you're using? So I think perhaps pointing to like specific work or methodologies that are influencing yours is a way to maybe open that door, that conversation. I'm a big proponent that feminism is for everyone, but I also too understand that the role that like labeling can have in one's work of either feeling like a space of co-opting or feeling perhaps not inclusive. The way I guess I would go around it or about it would be, perhaps citing specific pieces of work or specific methodologies that are influencing you or that you are following. And that could be a good way to talk about or engage with feminist practices without outright perhaps labeling yours as a feminist practice, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you so much.
Any other questions? So Erin does your intersectional feminist work ever cross over within the disability justice movement? Do you have examples where this might be happening in the context of COVID and technology access? I think that's a really fantastic question. I would say like the work that I do as a human rights researcher as an intersectional feminist works with and does acknowledge the disability justice movement. If you mean feminist data set in particular, feminist data set is sort of an interesting project in space in the sense that I don't ever submit work into it. I'm a facilitator, and so it is a reflection of those that choose to submit work. But in my own practice and in my design practice, and when I'm creating research about a problem, I center the experiences of all different kinds of users, including disabled users, including trans users, including users of all different racial backgrounds and demographics. In terms of like personally studying COVID and technology access, that's actually something I haven't studied for a variety of reasons. One, I don't have a background in public health, and so I felt as a practitioner, looking at COVID was not something that was a conversation I belonged in, for example. And not having a background in public health and also in things really related to the healthcare space, I have not really entered or looked or engaged with research in a professional capacity. And that also includes, in terms of lecturing, not wanting to provide answers or any guidance in that section, since it's not something I feel like I'm the right person to be talking about. So I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry. I wish I could provide more. I just don't feel like I'm the right person to even point in that direction, given my lack of background in terms of health and public access. But if you're looking for people to sort of follow or engage with, I'm a really big fan of Liz Jackson's work in terms of disability justice and running the disabled list. I think that they're really fantastic. Lindsay has a question. Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you. I especially loved your social media breakup part. Thank you. Could you talk more about what you have learned about your own work by being an American in Europe? I'm asking for a friend who's American in Canada. Oh, wow. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that I've sort of learned about my own work abroad is that it's just easier to be an artist and a researcher in countries that have social support. So it is a lot easier to, or not easier, I feel like it's more freeing to be an artist because you can be a lot more experimental in what it is you're focusing on. So in the US, I often felt like a very big pressure to have artifacts coming out of the work that I was making, and my work isn't really artifact driven. So it was really hard to create time and space to make art when that was something I had no ability to like make a living from. It got a lot easier in Europe in the sense that there's so much more support, just in terms of there being like artist groups you can join, the fact that healthcare is accessible and affordable. But that also, the way I describe this for a lot of Americans is, Europe is so much bigger than the United States. But like, imagine if every state in America had its own like state and city funding and its own new media museum or program. So like most states don't have that. So like in Europe, you just have access, at least I feel like I have access to so many more collaborations and materials because there is a lot of pan-European funding for artwork, but also different countries have different kinds of support towards engaging with the arts, which means that there are more arts organizations, which means those arts organizations have support to run residencies or programs, etc. So I think for me, it's just given me more of the ability to be more experimental. And I also felt in Europe, work or artistic work doesn't have to necessarily be so artifact driven. It really can be the manifestation of like a lecture. So I've really enjoyed that. The next question was, I really enjoyed your presentation. Can you share a link to your projects? Yes, they're all on my website, just at carolinesinders.com.
It looks like we have a question from Chris Meyer.
Okay.
Hi there, Caroline. Sorry,
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
All right, wonderful. Sorry, I scribbled down a question in my notes while you were speaking. I was trying to type it into the chat, and I just realized it's probably easier for me to try to stumble through it, quote unquote, face to face.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in this dark patterns example that you gave. And I'm a media artist whose work is very much shaped by software that's designed by companies like Adobe and Apple. And I was thinking about the dark patterns website example you gave, and I'm not sure this is a question you can address, but if you can, I'd be interested to hear your insights. And I'm wondering if you've identified similar sorts of design strategies in like creative software applications that either support or enable certain forms of media art or certain types of aesthetic, and maybe discourage or make it more challenging or difficult to make other forms of art and certain types of design aesthetic. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's a really, really good question. I haven't really noticed that. And I think that's probably because I tend to like misuse most of the tools that I use. Because I'm not really formally taught in a lot of like the Adobe products on how to use them like the right way. I do feel like generally like design, much like art, is really driven by aesthetics, and it's also tend to be driven by like popular aesthetics of the moment. And so I feel like that has perhaps a little less to do with the tools and a little bit more to do with what people fund or what becomes popular. And then I feel like the tools then almost follow that in a way to either facilitate those experiences more. But that was a really good question. I'm definitely going to think about it. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, no problem. And I think you got me thinking about something there. What you said about misusing those technologies. From my perspective, I think it's getting more and more difficult to do that. There's certain ways that the tools that we're using are pointing us towards certain types of work, but we can't. It's getting more and more difficult to create noise, if you will.
Totally. I mean, I think that there's like a lot of presets in tools that definitely make it harder to misuse them. But I feel like that also comes, with a lot of like mobile friendly tools. So like, I don't know if any of y'all have ever tried to use like any Adobe iPhone or like Android app. But it's like much smaller and there's only so many things you can do. And so I feel like in that space, there is like a flattening of like either conformity or only certain ways you can use things. So I definitely see that a lot in like tools that exist on like the mobile phone in terms of like augmentation, or that there isn't really a lot of augmentation, in mobile phone tools. Any other questions?
I have a question, Carolyn, if it's okay. So great. So you were talking a little bit about the work that you're doing with the UN, and I'm wondering if, I hear UN and I think of governance or policy work, and I'm wondering if the work that you're doing there is also informed by critical design practices, and if so, if you want to talk a little bit about that, your approach in those spaces, and how you bring this, the kind of work that you were telling us about, import that into those kinds of forums.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I definitely wear two different hats because I often spend a lot of time either working with policy members or chatting with regulators about sort of like the role of design or the problems within design, especially in the online harassment space, for example, which is, a policy problem as well as a design problem. And for the UN, it is an expert working group where we are helping craft and guide a manifesto and a lot of the UN's thinking on data governance related to children. And then within that, writing different kinds of papers to sort of help, again, inform their thinking. I think in a lot of these spaces, I'm often the only designer or the only, and often the only design practitioner. So, I'm often the only person that's ever actually like worked on a product before or have a background in design or knows what it takes to kind of build something. And so in a lot of these spaces, I'm often trying to advocate what I think of, or rather what is like the reality of how products are made versus this idea of how academics who are like policy researchers and academics think technology is made. And like what they think of how technology is made is often very different than how technology is actually made. So in a lot of these spaces, I'm really trying to advocate for like an understanding of the design process, some slight empathy for the designers and engineers who are building these tools, and then trying to expand the understanding that policymakers have around the decisions that people make internally, and then trying to shift those into a new space. So it's a little different than my critical design practice, but I think it's still a similar thought experiment in the sense of trying to translate concepts into arguments that make sense for this group that I'm talking to, policymakers, and then trying to get them to imagine this kind of new thing that they're talking about. So if they're talking about regulating dark patterns, I want them to think about, or at least know a little bit about design. I try to impart that on them, and then think together of like, what would realistic regulation look like if you now know or have some more of the language of design? How does that change the way we think about these spaces around us? So I would say it's very different but similar.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Francois asked a question of, thank you for linking art and design, wondering how archives mesh with exploratory practice. I mean, I think archives totally mesh. I'm making something right now that is a little bit of an archive, and feminist data set is effectively an archive. Like all the data that gets submitted is actually a form of an archive because it's all different kinds of text work. And so the goal is to share in some way all of the submitted work, which would function as an archive. I do think archives are I think they're extremely important. Like archivists and librarians are so important in terms of creating spaces of knowledge and new knowledge. I think for those that are interested in working with archives, the thing I always sort of think of, I always suggest is an archive can be incredibly experimental and incredibly exploratory, but think about what you mean when you say you want to work with an archive. Because archives should also be something that are easy to traverse, right? And easy to sort of like look for or compare knowledge within. So I think there are sometimes artists are interested in the idea of an archive. What they're actually interested in is like a data set that actually is pulling from like cultural artifacts or information, which like the closest analogy would be an archive. But what they're actually interested in is like bringing together a whole bunch of related ideas or things that are very, very related, but the output of it is not necessarily an archive. That's a really great question. I mean, I think archives are extremely important. I think that there's a lot of interesting work that can be done with them. But then, yeah, no, that was a fantastic question. Thank you. Do you have a follow-up question? Did I answer that, or would you like more information? Any other questions?
Luis, I see your hand.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you have any. Yeah, so the other day, one of my supervisors was asking me why I was producing something that was practice-based or art-based rather than something theoretical. So the supervisor was saying, well, you can probably, prove the same with a theoretical write-up. So I think this goes in relation to the critique that people have for the practice-based research. And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts in terms of why doing like something more practical rather than something theoretical?
Totally. I think that's a really great question. I mean, I think for me, I'm a practitioner. And so that's always the thing I like to emphasize to people. But I think we learn so much by doing. And I think in a lot of theoretical spaces, or I guess rather the way to think about it is when you take something and you put it into practice, you encounter all of the ways in which the world sort of impacts and bounces off whatever it is you've created or designed or whatever your theory is. And the thing I always like to remind people is that you can make something and you can test it 1,000 different ways, and people will use it in 1,000 and different ways. And so they'll interact with it and use it in ways that you can never imagine. And so what I like about a practice-based work and a practice that is an active practitioner is that I'm able to kind of test and reconfigure and see how things work. In terms of feminist data set, I think it has to be this process-driven active practice to sort of see, well, where does the practice fall apart? A thing that I talk about a little bit is like to actually make feminist data set, to make a real feminist AI system, it's a series of impossibilities. So it's a series of trade-offs one has to make. I'm having to like make tools that don't exist. I'm having to reconfigure protocols and processes. But at a certain point, I'm going to have to make a series of decisions of what is the more feminist outcome or decision to make while recognizing that it is not necessarily the most intersectional feminist decision I can make. Meaning at a certain point, I will have to decide or rather there won't be a way for me to make the step that I'm in. I'm going to have to kind of heed to where technology is. So for example, like with TRK, I'm using AWS and GitHub. Are those feminist protocols? And they're not, but that is where like the tools live, right? So it's almost like the closer you get to the metal, the more and more you go down in terms of this project, you realize that everything can't be remade. If Feminist Dataset were truly, truly an intersectional feminist project, I would have to reckon with, why am I using the computer that I'm using? At a certain point, maybe I would have to remake the computer, but I'd have to reckon with, how is the motherboard made and where does that copper come from? So what I like about this sort of non-theoretical practice is that you have to explain or justify and then do it and see, why are you making the decisions you've made, as opposed to just sort of talking about it in a theoretical sense. And, again, with Feminist Dataset, at a certain point, I will need to decide, when it comes time to clean and structure the data set, do I hire people? And what is a feminist way to work with other people? If I'm the person paying them, that's a power imbalance, right? And so that is like a structure and a process that has to be folded into the project. But, I think that it will benefit so much more, as opposed to theoretically saying, this is the way the relationship would go. Or this is what would unfold in that relationship. And again, like, no one knows until you actually engage with people, right? And so I think for me, process-based work and practice-based work is a way to investigate and test and see what works and what fails, and recognize that failure is a part of the testing process. So that's what I like about it. But I'm also a practitioner, so I'm biased about making things.
Thank you so much. That was so motivating for me. Thank you.
Anytime. Any other questions?
Well, if there aren't any other questions, then thank you again, Carolyn, for taking the time to be here today and to share your work with us in advance of the workshop next week. And thanks to everyone who's able to attend the talk today. I know it's a really busy time of year, and so we really appreciate you taking the time to be here. And we will make the recording of the talk available in time. And I'm sure it's something that you will be able to use, especially in teaching and learning environments. So thanks again, Carolyn, and thanks again to everyone for being here, and we'll see you all soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.